When I talk about the Bible, it's very personal, so I don't want to get into verses. I don't want to get into...
There's no verse that means a lot to you that you think about or cite?
The Bible means a lot to me, but I don't want to get into specifics.
Even to cite a verse that you like?
No, I don't want to do that.
You're an Old Testament guy or a New Testament guy?
Probably equal.
Hi again, everyone. It is 5 o'clock here in Washington, D.C. I'm Alicia Menendez in for Nicole Wallace. When Donald Trump was first running for the presidency, that is what we saw in his appeals to the religious right. Now, several years later, after having won over the evangelicals and nominated 3 justices to the Supreme Court who voted to overturn Roe v. Wade, Trump is showing Christians he is still their supposed champion. But his approach has taken a much darker turn. Last night, Trump spoke at the National Religious Broadcasters Convention in Nashville, where he characterized the upcoming election in the starkest of terms: a battle between good and evil, the need for Christians to safeguard themselves against a wicked system. And then he revived rhetoric that last year had the hair on the back of the necks of authoritarian experts stand up.
This time, the greatest threat is not from the outside of our country. I really believe this. It's from within. It's the people from within our country that are more dangerous than the people outside. We can handle China. We can handle Russia. We can handle all of them if you have a smart leader. But the inside people are very dangerous. They're very sick people, in my opinion, in many cases. They're sick.
And just to be clear, he wasn't talking about himself. Now, we don't like to further amplify Trump's fear-mongering, but it's important context to get the full picture of his authoritarian ways. When Trump first made comments about the enemy from within, Ruth Ben-Ghiat, a professor at NYU who studies fascism and is often on this show, said, quote, "There are echoes of fascist rhetoric, and they're very precise. The overall strategy is an obvious one of dehumanizing people so that the public will not have as much of the outcry at the things that you want to do. What Trump wants to do is win back the presidency and rule with absolute power. He believes the president can do whatever he or she wants. He has talked about weaponizing the Justice Department against his enemies. He's currently attempting to fight his criminal indictments by saying a president is immune from prosecution. It is an argument currently before the Supreme Court after a district court ruled against him in the federal election interference case, as well as defense he used in a filing just last night in the second of his federal cases, the classified documents one, saying that the decision to designate records as personal was an official act as president. With the 2024 race fully underway, we are seeing Trump's authoritarian bents become more and more overt and brazen. And that is where we start this hour with former Deputy Assistant Attorney General for National Security, MSNBC legal analyst Mary McCord. Also with me, Professor of Politics and Journalism at Morgan State University and an MSNBC contributor, Jason Johnson, and the founder of Democracy Docket and partner at the Elias Law Group, Mark Elias. A lot of friends with us at the table on Friday. When you hear all of that, Mary, which alarm bells go off for you?
Well, I mean, this is classic, him going out, him trying to pander to a particular crowd. And it's really, I think, offensive to people who actually are Christians to hear some of what he says. You know, Christians Against Christian Nationalism is one organization out there saying, look, you know, Christianity is about accepting all religions, not saying this is the only religion. So he's not being true to the you know, religious people who actually believe in what Christianity stands for. And again, it is that type of fear-mongering. It is that type of just simply pandering to those who we think he wants to hear that. To hop ahead, though, to his, you know, his motion last night on filed a similar motion to dismiss the Mar-a-Lago case, the classified documents case, very similar motion to the one that he filed in D.C., where he lost, where he said, I should be immune from criminal prosecution from everything that I did within the scope of my official acts of president. In D.C., he said everything he did that had to do with undermining the election was within his official acts, talking to his Department of Justice, talking to state legislators, talking to Mike Pence. Now he's saying everything I did with respect to the classified documents was within my official acts because I made the decision back when I was in the White House to designate some of these as presidential records. But notably, that would only help him for the classified documents offenses, right? Not the obstruction offenses, which there's no way he can say he committed those when he was back in office. But I think what he's trying to do here is get a different decision out of Judge Cannon than what he got out of Judge Chutkan, maybe hoping he'll get a different decision out of the 11th Circuit, maybe trying to convince the Supreme Court, keep waiting a while to decide, give me more time before you make any decisions about the pending motion in the Supreme Court to take this case. Because, look, we need to let this percolate down here in the 11th Circuit. He's really trying to create his own circuit split. I don't think he's going to get it, even if he gets a win from Judge Cannon. But I think he's trying to make this all look more attractive to the Supreme Court.
So let's tally it up, Mark. You have a perversion of religion. You have a perversion of justice. You have a perversion of democracy. And it's not just him. You had a right-wing conspiracy theorist at CPAC yesterday saying, I just want to say, welcome to the end of democracy. We're here to overthrow it completely. We didn't get all the way there on January 6th, but we will endeavor to get rid of it. It's not even saying the quiet part out loud. It's saying the quiet part with a bullhorn.
Absolutely. And this is not just some conspiracy theorist. I mean, CPAC is the Trump convention. Right.
No.
This is like, you know, the RNC and the Republican National Convention is all well and good. But if you want to know what Donald Trump and his supporters believe, CPAC is the blessed, it is the authorized vehicle for that. And so it is time for us to recognize that these are not just words. You know, when Donald Trump records a robocall or records a video for Ronna McDaniel of the RNC, he doesn't mean any of that. When he says these things out of his own mouth to the Christian organization, or at CPAC, his supporters talk about doing away with democracy, that's what they mean.
Yes.
When they say that this is following up on January 6th, that is what they mean. Mm-hmm. And so when you see them try to make it harder to vote and easier to cheat in elections, that is what they mean. And they mean it because they are trying to steal the outcome of the elections. They are trying to set up an excuse and a permission structure to engage not just in frivolous election litigation, like I was involved in fighting against for President Biden, but setting up the next January 6th. Mm-hmm.
Here's the thing, which is I think often we focus on Donald Trump for good reason, because he is persuasive. There are people who listen to him. At the same time, the threat has grown beyond Donald Trump. It is not as though if he doesn't win the nomination and doesn't win a second term, that the threat goes away, because there is now a legion of followers who are not pro-democracy, who are actively talking about overthrowing democracy. And so in that way, that is what actually needs reckoning with.
Alicia, the whole part about the sort of Trump rise that's always been problematic to me is that we don't spend, as you're pointing out, enough time talking about there's like 37% of the American population that's perfectly cool with white nationalism and fascism. Like he can't do what he's doing if there weren't groups of people who wanted to sit and listen to this nonsense at CPAC. Mm-hmm. I can tell you right now that I want to create the dictatorship of Jaysanistan, okay? And I can announce that right now. I promise you, no one is going to come to a conference to join Jaysanistan because no one believes me.
But I think you get like half a dozen people.
I think I get some of my students. Yes. I think, you know, maybe my mom, maybe my parents.
A half dozen of your
students. Half dozen. Oh, yeah. So that's the problem. The danger is that we have a CPAC conference full of people who worship this man. He's at a Christian conference, and I want to be clear, a Christian nationalist conference. Yeah, right. I know a lot of Christians. There's probably Christians on this set. Those people aren't there, right? These people aren't talking about the Bible that I have any understanding of. And so that is what's dangerous, that we have an increasing number of people who are perfectly okay, including a crazy guy who got a canceled television show who was hanging out in another country, who's basically saying if we have good grocery stores, it's okay to have a dictatorship. We have too many people who are saying that fascism is okay as long as the trains run on time. And that's the danger that Trumpism has created in our public discourse.
The fact that he is pushing this immunity argument to me is all part and parcel, right? Because there's this idea of I am greater, I am omnipotent, I can do whatever I want. And yes, that is about authoritarianism. It is also about sort of this idea of having a person who is called upon to be of service.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that a lot of the commentary on this network and more generally in the thoughtful media is about the impact that the immunity rulings will have on the trial date. And that is not to be ignored. But there's another reason why he is pushing so publicly this immunity argument. You know, sometimes, and I do a lot of work for candidates, and I know all of you have been involved in campaigns to one extent or another, you know, sometimes you want the candidate to run on a platform so that when they win, they can govern on it. And I think Donald Trump is also setting up a reality that he can say, if he were to win an election, Look, I told you I was running on an immunity platform. I told you from the day I announced I could shoot people on Fifth Avenue and still get elected. And I ran on a platform of defying court orders. I ran on a platform of not returning documents that I'm not entitled to. I ran on a platform of having January 6ers, acquire that I called hostages. And I ran on a platform of being able to be immune and do whatever I want when I invoke the Insurrection Act. And so I think it's very dangerous, not just because he's trying to delay his trial and all of that, but because he wants this to be a legitimized view if, God forbid, he were to be reelected.